at the bottom of Samaches Amid Beis 68b. I think I ended the recording before the last two lines of the Gemara, so we're going to go back a couple of lines. The Gemara, we're in Samaches Amid Beis 68b. This is the fourth to last narrow line. Rav Sheshes Kol Taltin Yomi Mahadali Talmud. Rav Sheshes would review his learning every 30 days. V'tali v'koy be'ivr the dasha, and he would lean on the doorpost of his house and he would say, Chadai nafshayi, my soul be happy, my soul be happy, be joyous. L'cha karoi, it is for you that I read. L'cha tanoi, it is for you that I learn the Mishnah. It is because of you I read the Torah. Because of you I read the Mishnah. I study, and so be joyous. Aini, Gemara says, but it's not so. We learned that the Torah is not only for one's own purpose. When one learns, they learn for themselves. No, there's more to it. You really sustain the entire universe. Rabbi Tzvi says, if not for Torah, the heaven and earth would not would sustain. Shanema, for it says, if not for my covenant, day and night, being studied day and night, or as Rashi says, the covenant of the obligation of studying day and night, I would not place the statutes of laws of nature of heaven and earth. So heaven and earth only is sustained by the study of Torah day and night. Mikara ki avidin shadaita denafshei. Sigmar says you're right, but when a person does it, it is for their own growth, for their own elevation, for their own soul. But the result is that it sustains the heaven and earth. So this is the end of the Gemara in regards to Torah and the obligation of joy on Yantiv, and going back to the argument in our Mishnah, for which they brought the argument of whether a rabbinic prohibition on Yantiv is for a mitzvah or not, which we saw at the end yesterday. So the question in the Mishnah is, if somebody is going to need to do a preparatory action in order to be able to do the Korban Pesach, whether that's permissible to be done even in a rabbinic prohibition, if that would hinder, if that would essentially disallow you from doing it, the rabbinic prohibition would not allow you to do it and therefore not be able to bring the Korban Pesach. Is that what we say? Or do we say no? For the mitzvah, you're allowed to do it, and therefore you could bring the Korban Pesach in such a manner. Rabbi Eliezer says, not only can you bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos, you're even allowed to carry it, meaning you're not only allowed to shecht it, but you're even allowed to carry it there, etc., because the things that are necessary to make the Korban work are allowed to be done even on Shabbos if it's a rabbinic transgression. And he learns it if Shechita, which is a Torah prohibition, is allowed to be done on Shabbos, for sure. A rabbinic prohibition, even though that the mitzvah is the obligation of Shechita, there's no obligation to carry it, and you could have done it beforehand, but nevertheless, that's the means that I need now in order to do the mitzvah. That's Rabbi Eliezer's Kal V'chomer. If the Torah prohibition is allowed, for sure the rabbinic prohibition is allowed. To which Rabbi Yeshua responded and said, actually, we see that by Yantiv, there are rabbinic prohibitions that are not allowed, yet the Torah prohibition of cooking, the Torah allows. So you can't tell me that everything is allowed. Amar Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi says, "L'mayda kamar Rabbi Eliezer nami Yantiv rishus islay pircha." Even according to what Rabbi Eliezer says, that there's no obligation on Rabbi Eliezer's response was to Rabbi Yeshua. He says, "You can't bring me proof from Yantif. It's true in Yantif. There's no you can't do rabbinic prohibitions. You can only do the Torah prohibition, which is cooking. That's because there's no obligation to do. There's no necessity to do that which is rabbinically prohibited. It's not bringing you to a mitzvah, because he says that the joy of Yantiv is not absolutely necessary. He says that learning Torah and davening could be a part of the mitzvah instead. So the Gemara, Rav Ashi says, even so, even if Rabbi Eliezer is correct that the obligation of bringing yourself joy on Yantiv is not an obligation, and therefore whatever you're going to do, even if it's rabbinically prohibited, is not really for a mitzvah, and therefore prohibited even if it's rabbinic. Nevertheless, Islay Percha, there's still a contradiction, there's still a question to his Kal V'chomer. Umay Yantiv shehitter by malacha shel reshus, lehitter shvus she'ima. Said, but if you're right, Rabbi Eliezer, that there's no obligation of eating and bringing yourself joy on Yantiv, because as we saw yesterday, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you could do Kollel Hashem, you could do everything on behalf of Hashem, meaning davening and learning. You could essentially fast on Yantiv. You don't need to bring yourself joy. Well, if that's the case, so cooking as well is not a necessity, and yet the Torah says you're allowed to cook on Yantiv. Right? It's a pasuk that we had in last week's parsha. That which is needed for food, that you're alone, you're allowed to do. And even though that's not a necessity, it's not a part of a mitzvah of Yantiv, and nevertheless the Torah says you're allowed to do it, and still rabbinic prohibitions are not allowed for that same purpose. Whereas in Shabbos, the only thing you're allowed to do is a malacha of mitzvah like shechting. So therefore, for sure, for sure, the rabbinic prohibitions that come along with the mitzvah should not be prohibited. It should not be permitted. In other words, we still see what Rabbi Eliezer was trying to prove was saying that since the Torah permitted shechita, it must also have allowed the prep work for the carbon, that which is not necessary for the carbon, but it's necessary in order to get to be able to do the carbon. If it's rabbinically prohibited, it should be permitted for the sake of the mitzvah. Just like shechita is permissible for the sake of the mitzvah. To which we say no. We see that by Yantiv, even though that the primary Torah prohibition was prohibited, which is normally prohibited, was permitted in this case, the rabbinic prohibitions that come along with it are not permitted. So to here, even though that the Torah prohibition is permitted in this case, the rabbinic prohibitions that come along with it are not. That's the argument against Rabbi Eliezer's Kal V'chomer. Rabbi Eliezer. And now we're at the top of Samach Tes Amud Aleph. Rabbi Eliezer is going to respond. Rabbi Eliezer shvus the mitzvah. Adiflei, the rabbinic prohibition, which is for a mitzvah itself, that is stronger to him. And he says, look, you can't bring me proof from rabbinic prohibitions that are not there to serve a specific mitzvah. Here, this is to serve a specific mitzvah, to bring the Korban Pesach. For that, the Chachamim would not have enacted their rabbinic prohibition, and therefore it is stronger, and the rabbinic prohibition does not supersede the mitzvah. The mitzvah supersedes the rabbinic prohibition. Tani. So we have a brisa that says, Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, "Amalim dacham achshirim mitzvah shala achar shchita es haShabbos desavid ba mitzvah leyitcha machshirim mitzvah shalifnei shchita es haShabbos." He has another proof to his idea that you can bring the Korban Pesach, even though that's not a part of the mitzvah, but that's necessary for the mitzvah. You're allowed to carry it in order to get to do the mitzvah. And he proves it from the fact that after the mitzvah is done, meaning the carbon has been shechted, and the 4 steps have been done, and the blood has been spritzed on the mizbeach. Now there are parts we saw in our Mishnah that are not necessary to be done right away, or are not a part of the mitzvah per se, such as michui karavav, which we saw yesterday was cleaning out the intestines, or the burning the fats on the mizbeach, also which we saw yesterday, that chaviva mitzvah v'shata, because even though that it's permissible to be done throughout the night, but nevertheless it is nice, it is precious to do the mitzvah in its proper time. See, so Rabbi Eliezer says, look, after the mitzvah, you have things that are done that are really not necessary for the mitzvah itself. The mitzvah is done, but they are in and of itself some sort of a work that's, let's call it secondary or prep work, and it's considered, and it's allowed to be done on Shabbos. So too, the prep work prior to the mitzvah, or not so too. For sure, the prep work prior to the mitzvah, which is going to get you to the mitzvah, you're allowed to do. Amalei Rabbi Akiva, to which Rabbi Akiva responded, the mainly, to me, what it's similar, meaning that I think that it goes the other way. The prep after the mitzvah, meaning the secondary parts of the mitzvah that come afterwards, they supersede Shabbos, because Shabbos has already been superseded for this mitzvah. So once you start the mitzvah of shchita, which supersedes Shabbos, so the rest of the mitzvah that will also supersede. The rest of the mitzvah will also. It's a part of the mitzvah that already broke Shabbos, as it were. You want to prove from that the prep work prior to the mitzvah should supersede Shabbos? No, and Shechita had not yet superseded Shabbos, and so it can't. You can't bring me proof from when the mitzvah is already superseded Shabbos, and so you continue completing it, versus where nothing has superseded Shabbos yet, and you're not even doing the mitzvah. You're only preparing to do the mitzvah. Davar acher. Another argument Rabbi Akiva had. Shema yimtza zevach pasul. Besides the prep work or the secondary work that's done after the mitzvah has been done, at that point we already know the animal is a kosher animal. It doesn't have any blemishes, etc., and it's a kosher korban. So therefore you can do it. But beforehand you're going to carry the animal from town to there. Which is rabbinically prohibited. You can't do it because maybe the animal turns out to be not kosher, not a kosher korban. And it turns out to be echel Shabbos lemafreya retroactively because it wasn't a korban. The Gemara says no, that's not a good argument because so then you can't even shecht it because maybe it's going to turn out to be a bad, invalid korban. Shemi says evach pasal. And retroactively, you will have broken Shabbos. Ella So Gemara says you're right. That's the first argument Rabbi Akiva said, to which Rabbi Eliezer responded and refuted his argument. And then he said, the mainly it seems to me that once Shabbos had been superseded, you began the mitzvah that supersedes Shabbos, you can complete it and do all its parts, but not so. The prep work in advance. The next argument Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Yeshua was an argument that Rabbi Akiva knew was wrong, but he wanted to prove a point. So Rabbi Akiva proved this from spritzing the red heifer water on someone who's tummy mace. That the halacha is, the Mishnah had said that if somebody was tummy mace and they came into contact with the dead, so they need to be tahar. They need a 7-day tahara process, 7 days to become tahar, and that process requires on the 3rd and 7th day to get spritzed by the red heifer water, by the mechatas. On the 7th day, if that's the 14th of Nisan. So the question is, can they bring the korban Pesach that day or not? Right now they're not tahor, but in the evening they will be. We'll see that machlokas later of whether or not you can bring a korban Pesach while now you are still tamei, but when the evening comes you will be tahor, whether that's valid or not. But assuming that it is, so the only way for you to be able to bring a korban Pesach is if you get spritzed on the 7th day. That day you will get spritzed. Send somebody to bring the korban Pesach on your behalf, And in the evening, it'll be kosher because in the evening, you'll already have completed your 7-day process. If it's Shabbos, you're not allowed to get spritz with the red heifer water the 7th day, the mechatas. Why? Because that's a form, it's a rabbinic prohibition, not a Torah prohibition, because it's a form of completing the person, right? Or fixing the person, as it were. And that's prohibited on Shabbos, of completing a vessel. Obviously, the person is not a vessel, so it's not the Torah prohibition, but it's similar to it enough that the Rabbanan made an enactment against it. So Rabbi Akiva said, look, there are Torah obligations of bringing a korban Pesach, and yet this person who's tamei and needs to be spritzed the 7th day will not be able to do it on Shabbos. To which Rabbi Eliezer says, well, I say maybe he can. If he can shech, so, which means he can bring the korban, so he can even have the red heifer water spritzed on him. To which Rabbi Akiva said, yes, John. John's asking, how can you do a bris on Shabbos? Because it completes a person. Actually, you can only do a bris on Shabbos for a bris that's on the 8th day, because that's the time. So that's the designated time as well in the Gemara and Shabbos. That's that there's a pasuk for that this is the date, the 8th day, on the 8th day. So even if it's Shabbos, but indeed 9th day, etc., you're not allowed to do it. Not only because it completes a person, but because you're causing a wound, and so it's a Torah prohibition to do it. Not only rabbinic prohibition, Torah prohibition to do the mitzvah. So there's a specific mitzvah in the Torah for the 8th day, like the korban Pesach, which you can do on Shabbos. So good comparison, good question, John. So Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva said to Rabbi Eliezer, his teacher, he said, well, maybe it's the other way around. Just as you can't get the red heifer water spritz on you, so too you can't do the shechita, the shechting of the korban Pesach on Shabbos. To which Rabbi Eliezer said, what are you talking about? Of course, there's that we have a pasuk for it. It says, in its proper time, even on Shabbos. And Rabbi Akiva knew that. But Rabbi Akiva wanted Rabbi Eliezer to say that so that Rabbi Akiva said, okay, you're right. But then where do you have a pasuk that tells me that carrying the korban or one of the other preparatory actions that are needed for the korban are allowed to be done on Shabbos? There's only the shechita of the korban, they actually sacrificing the korban on Shabbos. There's a pasuk for that. So it was sort of an argument that Rabbi Akiva knew was incorrect, so sort of silly, but it was baiting Rabbi Eliezer in order to be able to show him that the proof that you're allowed to do shechita, which is a verse in the Torah, does not exist for the other parts that Rabbi Eliezer wants to say is permissible. Hey, Shuv Rabbi Akiva v'ama hazotachech. So Rabbi Akiva made this really fallacious argument just in order to get the response which he needed in order to prove the distinction. And Rabbi Eliezer did not like that. It was his teacher. Tani Omer le Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, Akiva, b'shchita hishavtani. You made a mockery of me by shchita, by slaughtering b'shchita tehi misasei. I sense that your death is going to be in a slaughtering way as well. Unfortunately, as we know, the Romans killed Rabbi Akiva in a horrible death. Amalei. So Rabbi Akiva said to his teacher, Rabbi Eliezer, Al tachbireni b'shas hadin. While we're arguing in halacha, don't deny a teaching. Kach mekublani mimcha. This is what you taught us. Hazah shavusi. Even though that the spritzing of the red heifer water is a rabbinic prohibition, Shabbos, it nevertheless does not supersede Shabbos, and you can't do it. Now, so the Gemara interjects here and says, if Rabbi Eliezer taught it to Rabbi Akiva, my time kahadame. So why is he retracting over here? Amar Ula. So Ula suggests one reason why he retracted. Rabbi Eliezer ki agmari hazad truma agmari. That Rabbi Eliezer only said you cannot get the mechatas, the red heifer water spritzed on the 7th day to complete your tahara process if it's necessary for eating teruma. The teruma gufei le'dachei Shabbos, because the teruma itself doesn't supersede Shabbos, so therefore the completing the hazah, the spritzing of the red heifer water also wouldn't supersede Shabbos. However, Rabbi Akiva Nami ki oisvei hazad truma oisvei. And Rabbi Akiva also was asking him from teruma itself, shehi mitzvah, which is a mitzvah, and yet it doesn't supersede Shabbos. You see that a rabbinic prohibition is prohibited even in the case where it's therefore a mitzvah. However, Rabbi Eliezer thought that Rabbi Akiva was challenging him from the spritzing the red heifer water in order to do a carbon Pesach. However, Rabbah challenges Ula's interpretation here. Masav Rabbah, Heshiv Rabbi Akiva Hazai Thomas Meis Techiach. We have a brisa that explicitly said Rabbi Akiva challenged him from the spritzing of red heifer water on where somebody needs to become pure from having come into contact with the dead. And where the 14th of Nisan, our Pesach, is on Shabbos, and that's the 7th day of his Tahara process. So that it all comes together on that one day. It's Shabbos, it's Erev Pesach, that's the day that he can bring the carbon, and he needs to complete his Tahara process in order to be able to eat the carbon Pesach that night. And he can't do it because it's a rabbinic prohibition, shehi mitzvah. It's necessary for the mitzvah. V'hi mishum shvus, and it is a rabbinic prohibition, and yet it doesn't supersede Shabbos. So really, Rabbi Eliezer even taught him that you can't spritz red heifer water in order to make someone ready to bring the carbon Pesach. So if that's the case, my time Rabbi Eliezer. So why did Rabbi Eliezer not agree? Why did he retract his teaching? Rabbi Eliezer Gamri is accurately. He forgot. Rabbi Eliezer forgot his own teaching. He forgot that he had taught that the rabbinic prohibition of spritzing red heifer water on someone on the 7th day to complete their tahara process is prohibited, even on Shabbos, even for a mitzvah. V'asar Rabbi Akiva lad kuri, and Rabbi Akiva wanted to remind him, Gamri, his teaching. So why didn't he just tell him outright? No, you taught us this. Savar lavai rachara. He thought that was that was embarrassing. It's not respectful for a student to tell the teacher, teacher, you're wrong. You taught us the complete opposite. So instead, he tried to do it by asking him questions to which he would remember on his own. But he didn't appreciate that. And now the Gemara says, so why indeed is it that the spritzing of the red heifer water does not supersede Shabbos? I already told you the conclusion of the Gemara. The Gemara has a first thought that the reason you're not allowed to do it is mechti tilto ba'almo. Perhaps that he's going to be moving. He's going to be carrying the red heifer water, and the carrying the red heifer water is a muktzah. Titri Shabbos, so let it supersede Shabbos because he's just moving it, and so let it supersede on the Mishum Pesach for Pesach. So Gemara says, Amar Rabba. Rabba said the reason is he's afraid that maybe you're going to carry it for Amos in a public domain. So the Gemara says, so what? For Rabbi Eliezer Niavre, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you should be allowed. Because anything that you need for the mitzvah supersedes Shabbos. Says no. The reason is the person at the time that the red heifer water is being done for him is actually not worthy of the carbon Pesach himself. He's not able to bring the carbon Pesach, so for him you can't supersede Shabbos. And so when he has an obligation, he already is obligated in the mitzvah, and so for him, Rabbi Eliezer says even preparatory actions for the mitzvah are allowed to be done on Shabbos because he has an obligation to do. But over here, he actually doesn't have the mitzvah yet because he's tummy. We want to get him out of his tummy status in order to be able to bring the carbon Pesach. Well, that's he doesn't have an obligation right now that's obligating him to break this rabbinic prohibition. So Rami Chiyuva, there is no incumbency upon him right now that would allow him to supersede Shabbos. Amar Rabbi Divrei Eliezer. So Rabbi said, according to this teaching, if that's correct, katan bari mechamel lechamen lahavrosin, a child that's healthy, that's completely fine, in order to get heat water for his bris. It's the 8th day, so you're allowed to heat water on Shabbos since he's already healthy enough for the bris. So we're going to wash him off and with hot water to make him more ready, but and heat the water on Shabbos, even though you're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. But because he right now is ready for it. An ill child, you're not allowed to cook water and to heat water in order to bathe him in before the bris, because that even though that after the bath he'll be ready for a bris, but right now he's not ready for it, and therefore you can't do it. Amar Rava v'ibari hu lama lechamen lahavrosin. So if he's healthy, why would you even be heating the water for him? Ela Amar Rava, the Rava says that the reason you'd be heating the water for him is that yes, he may be healthy in and of itself, but in order to be healthy enough to have a bris, you want to make sure he's not going to get ill afterwards from the bris. You have to make sure that he's clean. So you're heating the water for that. So hakol chaylein eitzel mila. That means everybody is considered ill in regards to a mila, and therefore so you're actually not allowed to cook water for anybody for a bris on Shabbos. You have to do that before Shabbos. Because nobody is actually, because they are not in a state of readiness for the bris. So the idea is you have to be in a state that you are already complete, ready for the mitzvah, in order to for it to supersede. But here Rabbi Eliezer says, even though he holds that even preparatory actions for the mitzvah supersede the mitzvah, that's only when the person is already obligated. It says obligation supersedes Shabbos, but over here he's not even obligated yet, and that's why Rabbi Eliezer says you cannot spritz the red heifer water on someone in order to get them ready for bringing the Korban Pesach, because they don't have an obligation at this point. There is no obligation. That the spritzing of the red heifer water is to make the obligation. That you can't make an obligation in order to supersede Shabbos. The obligation has to supersede the Shabbos, and you don't have an obligation yet. Esav Abai. So Abai challenged. Arel Shalei Mo. Onish Karis. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. It's somebody who didn't isn't circumcised cannot bring a Korban Pesach, and if he didn't do a bris, didn't give himself a bris, so he gets he blocked himself, as it were, by not making himself ready for a Korban Pesach. He blocked his obligation of bringing a Korban Pesach, and not bringing a Korban Pesach is a kares. A prohibition punished by the soul being cut off from its source, and since he had the obligation to the opportunity in the afternoon of the Pesach when he needs to bring the korban to make himself ready, and he didn't, so that's kares. Now he challenges but at the moment that the Korban Pesach obligation came, he was not obligated, because he doesn't have he's not worthy of the Korban Pesach, as it were. He's not able to bring the Korban Pesach because he doesn't have a bris. He never had a bris. And yet, okatani onish kares. And yet we say that he's going to be held liable, and his punishment is kares, is soul cut off from its source. Alma ramichu yuvei. So we see that there is an incumbency upon him, even though that he's not worthy or ready for the mitzvah. He has to first get himself more ready, and nevertheless, the incumbency is upon him, because if there was no incumbency, no obligation for the mitzvah, so then how can you hold him responsible? So the Rabbi Eliezer is going to hold of a concept which I brought up earlier, that the halacha is, in order to bring a carbon pesach, you have to be able to eat it that night. That's what the purpose of the carbon pesach is, to be able to eat at night. What happens if someone is not in their state that they are right now? If that were to be their state tonight, they wouldn't be able to eat the carbon pesach. So right now, they are not able to eat the carbon pesach. Right now, they can't bring the carbon pesach. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that it doesn't make a difference that by the time the sun sets, that status will change and they'll be allowed to eat the carbon pesach. Right now, they're not a gavrei chazi. Right now, they're not a person that is ready for the carbon pesach. They are not allowed to bring the carbon pesach. So that's the first step of understanding Rabbi Eliezer. So therefore, he says there is no incumbency upon this person, since that evening he won't be able to bring the carbon pesach. However, somebody tamei, somebody who didn't have the red heifer water spritzed on him on the seventh day, that's a lack of ability to bring the carbon pesach now, because till the end of the day, the entire time of when the carbon pesach is meant to be brought, they are not able to be a part of the carbon pesach. So even though at night it'll be available for them, they're not allowed to bring it. So that's for tumah. Even for a tumah sheretz, which is a minor tumah that only lasts for that same day. But nevertheless, until the end of the time of the carbon pesach shechting, they're not able to. They're not allowed to bring the carbon pesach. Right, Tavul Yom is going to be different because he already went to the mikveh. John is asking, what about a Tavul Yom? Somebody who went to the mikveh and by the time the evening comes, he should be allowed to eat it. That's right, John. That's what he says. A tomei sheretz. Somebody went to the mikveh that day, and the sun needs to still set on him. It would not be right now. They're not in their state now. They can't eat the carbon pesach, so they're not allowed to participate in the carbon pesach. That's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. However, somebody who doesn't have a bris, somebody who needs a circumcision, there is a process that they can make themselves obligated right now. Now, the next step in understanding this is that there's a communal obligation of bringing a carbon pesach in tumah. There's the status for which somebody is allowed to be pushed off to the second pesach. The spritzing of the red heifer water is going to be different. The pushing off for the second Pesach has to be similar to the postponement to second Pesach has to be similar to that obligation that's allowed in a communal obligation of the first Pesach, meaning that the spritzing of the red heifer water is not similar to the obligation of the bris. The spritzing of the red heifer water is going to make you allow you to bring the carbon pesach. That only applies to an individual, meaning if the entire community or the majority of the community were tamei for having come into contact with a dead person, we don't say, oh, there's an obligation for everybody to get spritz with the red heifer water. Actually, no. They can bring the carbon pesach in this state of tumah because the individuals are allowed to, because only individuals are postponed to the second Pesach. The entire community or the majority of the community can bring the carbon Pesach now in tumah. So there's no obligation of spritzing the red heifer water on the community, only on individuals. Yeah. So even though that the spritzing the red heifer water would help the community, they're not obligated to do it. It's an obligation only for the individual to get spritzed in the afternoon, and therefore the tumah that if somebody were in a state of tumah right now, just like the community would not need to have the red heifer water spritzed on them, so too the individual is not able to bring the Korban Pesach in this state, and the spritzing the red heifer water would not help him, because you can't bring it, would not allow him to bring it, because just as for the community there's no obligation, for individual there's also no obligation. And as the Gemara says, the first line on Samach Tesamid base 69b, v'chol she'ilu b'yachid nidche b'tzibur avdi b'tuma. And anything that an individual would be postponed to the second Pesach, the first Pesach the community can bring while in tummy, meaning they don't have to have the red heifer water spritz on them, even if it's the seventh day of Tumah. V'chol milsa the isa b'tzibur isa b'yachid. So whatever obligation there is on the community, there is on the individual, and the individual, and anything that is not obligated on the community, such as spritzing the red heifer water on them, so leisa b'yachid. So therefore, on an individual also, there is no obligation for him to get the red heifer water spritzed on Shabbos, and spritzed on him, and therefore on Shabbos it doesn't supersede, since it's not obligatory for him. As we said, that which is obligatory for the community is obligatory for the individual. However, arelos, but in regards to not having had a bris, the ikulet tzibur arelim ninu amrin lu kumimuhulu. That if the majority of the community didn't have a bris, we wouldn't say, oh, just like if the majority are tummy, they can bring the Korban Pesach even though they're tummy, so too, if the majority are uncircumcised, didn't have a bris, so then they can bring the Korban Pesach while being in this state of not having had a bris. No, that's not true. We would tell them all, it's the 14th of Nisan in the afternoon, everybody needs a bris, and then you can bring the Korban Pesach. Vavida Pischa. First get yourselves bris and then bring the Korban Pesach. And indeed, that was the case by Yehoshua and the first Pesach that came back in when they were coming into Eretz Yisrael. So too for the individual, we tell him, look, you have to get up and do a bris, even though he's not obligatory now. It is not incumbent upon him now because he's not a person that's worthy of it. Nevertheless, he needs to get himself ready for it. And therefore, if he doesn't get himself a bris, and on account of that loses the Korban Pesach, on Ishkaris, he's going to have a kares, the punishment of not having brought the Korban Pesach, which is the soul cut off from its source. Tuma the ikulat zibura tameininu leimarina we don't spritz on them. If Tuma, where everybody is Tame, Lemadina Nalai, we don't spritz upon them the red heifer water, because they can bring the Korban Pesach Ela Avdi B'Tuma. They bring the Korban Pesach in a state of Tuma. Because as we saw, the Tuma Hutra B'Tzibur, that when the community or the majority of the community are Tame, they can bring the Korban Pesach. So therefore, if the 14th day of Nisan ended up being the 7th day of everybody's Tahara process, we would not say, let's spritz that red heifer water on them and then bring the Korban Pesach. No such obligation. In their state of Tumah, the Korban Pesach is allowed to be brought in Tumah. Yachid Nami Pater. So therefore, an individual as well on the 14th day of Nisan, that ends up to be his 7th day of Tahara, he's not obligated in spritzing himself, having himself spritz with the red heifer water. And as such, it doesn't supersede Shabbos because it's not an obligation that's incumbent upon him right now. So Rav Huna Berei V'Shua challenges this logic, and it says, "Amalei Rav Huna Berei V'Shua Rava V'Harei Pesach Sheni, the Leisa B'Tzibur V'Isa B'Yachid." How can you tell me that these obligations are linked? Whatever the community has an obligation, that's where the individual has an obligation. And if the community does not have an obligation, the individual doesn't have an obligation. Is that really true? V'harei Pesach Sheni, the entire obligation of the second Pesach, the 14th day of Iyar, as a makeup date for somebody who missed the first Pesach because they were tummy. That only applies to an individual. It doesn't apply to community. As we said, only the individuals are pushed to the second Pesach, not a community. The leisa b'tzibur, v'isa b'yachid, and yet there is an obligation on the individual, even though there's no obligation on the community. So how can you tell me there's a communal obligation but not an individual obligation? If there's a communal obligation, there's an individual obligation. If there's no communal obligation, there's no individual obligation. I'm showing you an entire concept that only applies to the individual. So Gemara says, Amalei, he said to him, Shani hasam da'avid le'bitzibura berishan. Yeah, the reason is because the rest of the community already fulfilled their obligation in the first Pesach. That's the nature of this process. Everybody does the Pesach in the first on the 14th of Nisan, and whoever missed it because of the Tumah is going to do it in the second Pesach. You're going to tell me, wait, but the community is not doing it then, so how can the individual be obligated? The community is not doing it because they already fulfilled their obligation the first time around. Mesavik. So we ask a contradiction. Maybe the prohibition, the punishment of kares for not having made the carbon pesach only applies, or the exemption from kares really only applies to somebody who was tamei or was distant. But anybody that was tahor, somebody who was did not have the exemption of that he was tamei, that he was spiritually impure, and he doesn't have the exemption that he was too distant from Yerushalayim, so he couldn't bring it. This person was close by; he was in Yerushalayim. Orel v'tamei, that's where they get kares. But what about somebody orel that was uncircumcised? With tamei sheretz, so somebody who had come into contact with a different form of tumah, not tamei mace, not somebody who came into contact with the dead, but with sheretz, eroded, v'shar kol tameim, or any other form of tumah. Minayin, how do we know that somebody like that didn't take care of themselves and didn't bring the carbon pesach also is going to have a kares, the punishment of their soul being cut off? V'ha'ish. That's why it says v'ha'ish, somebody who and the person who doesn't bring the carbon pesach. So that tells you other things included as well. Now, hader atamei sheretz, since it mentions specifically tamei sheretz, somebody who came into contact with a sheretz that day, so that by the evening he'll be okay. Kasavar and shechtav zarkin al tamei sheretz, must be that you don't bring a carbon pesach for somebody who's tamei sheretz, even though he's going to be tamei, that is going to be available that evening. The shechtav zarkin tamei sheretz lameleha adureli. Why do I need a special teaching to tell you that somebody like that doesn't bring the carbon pesach is included in the kares? This is a regular obligation. Why would he be exempt because he's tamei sheretz right now? In any case, we bring the carbon pesach for him because he can eat it at night. So from the fact, the fact that it mentions specifically that somebody like that cannot bring is anish kares, gets the punishment. So that means that that I would have thought he's not obligated, and therefore not included. So how can you tell me that shechtav v'zarkin al tamei sheretz? So we're going to end tomorrow, Be'ez Hashem, tomorrow after Shabbos, we'll review this brisa, explain the question again, and get to the Gemara's response. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.
Good Shabbos, Rabbi.
Shabbos.
Pesach.
Sure.
Good Shabbos.